My name is James Porter. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people would describe as steady, dependable, the kind of man who shows up early, leaves late, and doesn't make much noise about either. I've worked in a professional field that values reliability over visibility, and I built a reputation as someone you could trust with responsibility, just not necessarily with the spotlight. If you'd asked people who knew me back then to describe me, they might have said I was quiet, maybe even a little passive. Not weak, just agreeable. The sort of man who doesn't argue in meetings, who listens more than he speaks, who lets others take credit if it keeps the peace. At home, I was the same. I believed that harmony was something you protected by softening yourself around its edges. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about proving someone wrong or painting myself as a hero after the fact. It's about clarity, how it arrives slowly, almost invisibly, and how easy it is to miss the warning signs when they're wrapped in familiarity and love. The title of this story mentions money, and yes, finances play a central role. But what I'm really talking about is control, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't raise its voice or slam doors. The kind that hides behind phrases like, "I'm just better with numbers," or "this is easier if one of us handles it." The kind that convinces you over time that giving up small pieces of yourself is the same thing as being a good partner. This is the story of my marriage, and how it slowly shifted into something I didn't recognize until I was already living inside it. It's about how every dollar I earned passed through hands that weren't mine, and how I told myself that was normal. Responsible, even. It's about the things people around me never questioned, and the things I didn't question either, until I finally did. There are no dramatic confrontations in this story, no screaming matches, no sudden triumphs. What happens instead is quieter than that, more uncomfortable. Because the truth is, most real damage doesn't announce itself. It settles in gradually, disguised as routine. I'm sharing this now not to ask for sympathy and not to assign blame, but because I know there are people listening who might recognize pieces of themselves in what I describe. People who are competent, capable adults, yet somehow feel smaller inside their own lives than they should. People who can't quite explain why something feels off, only that it does. I won't exaggerate what happened. I won't hide my own mistakes either. This is an honest account of how financial control can take root in a relationship, how easily it can be overlooked, and what it takes, not emotionally, but internally, to step out of it. So before we go any further, I want to ask you something gently, without judgment. Have you ever looked at your own life and wondered when, exactly, you stopped having a say in parts of it you once owned? Before anything went wrong, before money became a word that carried tension instead of neutrality, I was already playing a role. I just didn't know it yet. Just didn't know. To my coworkers, I was the dependable one. The man who never complained about workload, who didn't push back when deadlines tightened or expectations quietly expanded. If someone needed help staying late, I stayed. If a project needed smoothing over, I handled it. I wasn't invisible exactly, but I was background, structural. Like a beam, you don't notice unless it cracks. At home, that perception followed me. My wife used to introduce me as the stable one. She said it with a smile, and people nodded approvingly. Stability is attractive. It sounds like safety. What no one asked, and what I never volunteered, was what that stability cost me internally. Stability, in my case, meant I absorbed pressure so others didn't have to feel it. I earned well. Not extravagantly, but consistently. My income covered the mortgage, utilities, groceries, insurance, everything essential. Early in our marriage, when we talked about finances, it felt natural that she'd take the lead. She was more vocal, more confident with decisions, quicker to speak. I told myself that division of labor was healthy. I worked, she organized, teamwork. People around us reinforced that idea without realizing it. Friends would joke that I was lucky not to have to worry about bills. Family members praised her for keeping things together, and every time I smiled and agreed, because disagreeing would have felt petty, unmanly even. What they didn't see was how quickly my role narrowed. I wasn't asked what I wanted to spend money on. I was informed what we were prioritizing. I wasn't consulted about long-term plans. I was reassured they were handled. At first, it felt like relief. One less thing to think about after long days at work. I mistook the absence of friction for balance. When people looked at us from the outside, they saw a functional marriage. No public arguments, no visible chaos. I was calm, she was decisive. It fit a narrative everyone understood: the quiet husband, the capable wife. And I leaned into that identity because it was easier than questioning it. Inside, though, something subtle was happening. My sense of ownership over my own life was thinning, not dramatically, but incrementally. Like erosion, you only notice once the shoreline is already gone. I stopped checking bank statements regularly. I stopped asking questions that might sound like doubt. I told myself trust meant letting go. If I'm honest, part of me liked being underestimated. There's a strange comfort in low expectations. When no one expects resistance from you, you're praised for endurance instead. I became the man who didn't need much. The man was content with less because wanting more would have disrupted the image. I began to believe that story about myself. At gatherings, conversations would drift toward finances or future plans, and my wife would answer on our behalf. I stood beside her, nodding, silent. People assumed that silence meant agreement. I let them. Speaking up felt unnecessary, even indulgent. Looking back now, I can see that I was slowly being reduced to a function rather than a participant. Provider, support, background stability. Useful but not consulted. Present but not central. And the dangerous part is this: none of it felt abusive at the time. It felt normal, because nothing was taken all at once. No one grabbed control outright. I handed it over in small, reasonable pieces, each one justified by love, trust, or convenience. Each one is invisible on its own. That's who I was to them back then. The man who didn't push back. The man who made things easier by making himself smaller. The man everyone thought they understood, because I never gave them a reason to look closer. And for a long time, neither did I. The first moment didn't feel important. That's what made it dangerous. It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind that disappears into memory unless something goes wrong. I had come home later than usual, tired but in a good mood. I just received a modest performance bonus at work, not life-changing, but enough to feel proud of. I remember mentioning it casually while we were clearing dishes from the table. Her response was immediate and practical. "That's good," she said. "We'll put it toward the credit card." Not what we should consider. Not what do you want to do with it. Just a statement, decided, closed. I nodded. I didn't even pause long enough to notice the absence of discussion. Paying down debt was responsible, sensible. The kind of thing a mature couple does. Any hesitation on my part would have sounded selfish, like I cared more about myself than the household. Still, something registered, quietly. Later that night, when I logged into my banking app out of habit, I noticed the bonus was already gone, transferred out, allocated, absorbed. The efficiency of it impressed me more than it concerned me. She was organized, on top of things. I told myself that was a good thing. That was the first cut. Not because money moved, but because a decision passed without me. I didn't bring it up. There was nothing to confront. No argument to have. If I had tried to explain the faint discomfort I felt, it would have sounded ridiculous even to me. I just wanted to talk about it first. Doesn't carry much weight when the outcome is objectively reasonable. Over the next few weeks, similar moments followed. Small enough to ignore. Familiar enough to normalize. I mentioned wanting to replace my aging laptop, something I use daily for work. She told me to hold off for now because we were tight this month. I accepted that explanation without question. After all, she saw the numbers. I didn't. When my car needed routine maintenance, she scheduled it herself and reminded me to stick to the budget while it was in the shop. The phrasing caught me off guard. Stick to the budget, as if it were a set of rules I was prone to breaking rather than a shared plan I helped create. Each time, I told myself the same story. This is what partnership looks like. Someone has to steer. What I didn't notice was how consistently that someone was never me. Friends were present for some of these moments, and none of them reacted. Once, at dinner, a friend joked about an expensive gadget he'd bought on impulse. My wife laughed and said, "That would never fly in our house." Everyone laughed with her. I smiled too. Inside, I felt something tighten. Not anger, not yet. More like a reminder that my autonomy was now a punchline I was expected to enjoy. But again, I said nothing. The cut stayed small, almost polite, wrapped in logic and responsibility. If she'd yelled or demanded or accused, I might have noticed the shift sooner. Instead, everything came dressed as concern, as care, as maturity. I began asking permission without realizing I was doing it. Is it okay if I grab lunch out today? Do you think it's a bad time to buy this? Each question trained me further in the role. Each approval reinforced the hierarchy. And because the answers were usually reasonable, sometimes even kind, I never felt justified in resisting. The people around us saw a healthy dynamic. A couple with clear roles, a wife who managed details, a husband who trusted her. What they didn't see was how trust, when unexamined, can slowly hollow out choice. That first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't hurt enough to name. But it marked the beginning of something important. The moment my financial life stopped feeling like mine and started feeling like something I was allowed to participate in, conditionally. And once you accept that condition once, it becomes easier to accept it again. What happens after the first small cut isn't shocking. It's repetition. The same patterns return, dressed slightly differently each time, until they stop feeling like incidents and start feeling like the environment. You don't react to the air around you. You just breathe it. By then, I had learned which topics to approach carefully. Money was one of them. Not because it caused arguments, we rarely argued, but because it caused subtle shifts in tone. A tightening of her voice. A look that suggested impatience rather than disagreement. It wasn't anger, it was dismissed. If I asked about an expense, she'd answer quickly, as if the matter were already settled. If I asked for details, she'd summarize instead of showing me. "It's all fine," she'd say. "I've got it under control." That phrase, "I've got it under control," became a wall I didn't know how to push against without sounding accusatory. I told myself I was being respectful, that I didn't need to scrutinize every decision. Those relationships weren't accounting exercises. And because nothing outwardly bad was happening, bills were paid, lights stayed on, our lifestyle remained stable, I learned to treat my discomfort as immaturity. So I adjusted. I stopped asking follow-up questions. I stopped opening the banking app altogether. When coworkers talked about investments or saving strategies, I listened politely but stayed quiet. It felt strange to admit that I didn't fully know what our financial picture looked like anymore. Stranger still to admit that I'd let it happen. The disrespect, when it appeared, was rarely direct. It was procedural. She'd make decisions and inform me afterward. She'd reframe my suggestions as impractical before I'd finished explaining them. If I expressed uncertainty, she'd reassure me, gently, almost maternally, that I didn't need to worry about those things. And I accepted that framing because it was easier than challenging it. Once, I remember suggesting we set aside a small personal allowance for each of us. No questions asked, just discretionary spending. The idea was practical and fair. She smiled, nodded, and said, "That sounds nice, but it's not really necessary. You don't spend much anyway." The conversation ended there. It wasn't the refusal that stayed with me. It was how she defined me in that moment. "You don't spend much anyway." As if that were an inherent trait, not a behavior shaped by constraint. Over time, I began internalizing that version of myself. The man who didn't need much. The man who was low maintenance. the man whose desires were optional. And the world rewarded that version of me. Friends praised my simplicity. Family members commented on how easygoing I was compared to other husbands. Even at work, my willingness to accommodate made me indispensable. Everyone benefited from my compliance, except me. Still, I rationalized everything. I told myself that relationships require compromise, that leadership has to come from somewhere, that I was choosing peace over friction. I believed that being calm meant being mature. What I didn't understand yet was that calm can also be a survival strategy. There were moments, brief, almost embarrassing ones, when I felt something close to resentment. Watching her make a purchase without hesitation while I debated the cost of lunch. Hearing her refer to our budget as if it were a document I'd never seen. But I pushed those feelings down quickly. Resentment felt ugly, unjustified. After all, she wasn't cruel, she wasn't reckless, she wasn't obviously wrong. That's how disrespect survives. It doesn't announce itself as harm. It presents itself as efficiency, as competence. Love is expressed through control. The more it repeated, the more normal it became. And the more normal it became, the harder it was to imagine any other way of living. I stopped thinking in terms of what I want and started thinking in terms of what makes sense, which increasingly meant whatever she had already decided. By the time I noticed how small my voice had become in my own life, I had already learned to speak quietly enough that no one else could hear it, including me. Roles don't arrive with instructions. They form gradually, shaped by repetition and reward, until stepping outside of them feels like a violation rather than a choice. By that point in my marriage, my role was clear, even if no one had ever said it out loud. I was the provider, but not the planner. The engine, not the driver. My responsibility was to earn consistently, to be reliable, and not to introduce uncertainty. Her responsibility, unspoken but widely accepted, was to decide how everything moved once the money arrived. The arrangement wasn't framed as unequal. It was framed as efficient, complementary, sensible. And because I didn't resist it early, it hardened. When extended family visited, she handled conversations about our future, savings, travel, home improvements. I stood nearby, listening to plans being described that I hadn't participated in creating. Occasionally, someone would turn to me and ask, "Does that sound right to you?" I'd smile and say, "Yeah, that sounds good." Not because I fully agreed, but because disagreeing in that moment would have felt disruptive, as if I were breaking character. At work, I noticed a parallel. I was trusted with execution, not vision. People came to me to fix problems, not to ask what should be done next. And I excelled in that space. I became known as someone who didn't need supervision, someone who didn't push for recognition. The truth is, I had trained people to treat me that way. At home, that training continued. If something went wrong financially, it was framed as an external issue, an unexpected expense, a market shift, never a decision that could be questioned. And if I asked too many questions, even politely, I could feel the temperature change. Not anger, something colder. Impatience. The message was subtle but consistent. My job wasn't to understand, it was to trust. Over time, I began anticipating expectations before they were stated. I adjusted my behavior to avoid friction. I learned when to stay quiet, when to nod, and when to step back. This wasn't demanded of me, I offered it, because it kept things smooth, predictable, safe, but safety came at a cost. I stopped seeing myself as someone whose preferences mattered. I stopped imagining alternatives. I became useful in a very specific way. I made the system run without asking where it was going. What disturbed me most, in retrospect, was how natural it all felt. There was no dramatic moment where I realized I'd lost something, just a growing sense that certain parts of life were no longer available for discussion. I remember one evening, standing in the kitchen, listening to her explain a financial adjustment she'd already made. As she spoke, I realized I didn't even know the login information to our main account anymore. The thought passed through my mind briefly, and then I let it go. She knows what she's doing, I told myself. Why create tension? That was the role. The man who doesn't create tension. Reliable, useful, invisible. And the world reinforced it constantly. No one questioned why I wasn't more involved. No one asked if I was okay with the arrangement. The absence of conflict was mistaken for health. I mistook it too. Because stepping out of the role would have required something I wasn't ready to risk yet, being seen as difficult, as ungrateful, as someone who disrupts instead of supports. So I stayed where I was expected to stay. And in doing so, I slowly disappeared from decisions that shaped my own future. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment that would look significant from the outside. It happened in silence. I was alone in the apartment that afternoon. A rare occurrence. She was out running errands, and I'd taken the day off work to reset after a long project. The place was quiet in a way it rarely was. No background noise, no sense of being managed or observed. I sat at the small desk in the corner of the living room, flipping through an old leather notebook I'd kept for years. It wasn't a financial ledger, it was something more personal. Notes from different phases of my life. Career goals I'd written down in my 20s, ideas I'd never shared, reflections I'd almost forgotten existed. Reading my own handwriting felt strange, familiar but distant. I came across a page where I'd written about autonomy, about wanting a life where I understood the systems I lived inside. I wasn't dependent on someone else to explain my own situation to me. At the time, it had felt like a basic adult expectation. I closed the notebook and sat there longer than I meant to. That's when the question surfaced, not angrily, not dramatically, but with unsettling clarity. When was the last time I actually saw our full financial picture? Not a summary, not a reassurance, the actual numbers. I tried to remember and I couldn't. The realization didn't cause panic, it caused something quieter. A sense of misalignment, like discovering you've been walking slightly off balance for years without noticing, and suddenly you feel every step. I stood up and opened my laptop. Logging into my email, I searched for old bank notifications. Most of them stopped years ago. I hadn't noticed when they'd disappeared. I assumed settings had changed, or that she'd consolidated accounts for simplicity. Efficiency, I thought. But the longer I sat there, the less comfortable that word felt. I didn't confront her when she got home. I didn't even mention what I'd been thinking. I watched her move through the apartment, confident, efficient, certain. The same certainty I'd relied on for years. For the first time, it didn't reassure me. That night, lying in bed, I noticed how carefully I chose my words when we talked. How instinctively I avoided questions that might sound like challenges. I saw the pattern clearly, almost clinically. And I understood something important. Nothing external needed to change for me to feel this way. The shift was internal. I wasn't angry. I wasn't planning anything. I was simply no longer asleep to the imbalance. The next morning, I woke up with an unfamiliar sense of resolve. Not to confront, not to accuse, but to understand. I wanted information, not to win an argument, but to ground myself in reality again. For the first time in years, I felt the difference between peace and avoidance. Peace has weight, avoidance is hollow. And I had been living in the hollow. I went through the day as usual. Went to work, answered emails, spoke when spoken to. No one noticed anything different, but internally, something had aligned. I realized that silence until now had been reflexive, automatic, the silence of someone trying not to disrupt. What I felt now was different. It was intentional. I didn't know yet what I would do with that clarity. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even know what I might find if I looked more closely. But I knew one thing with certainty. I would no longer choose ignorance just to preserve comfort. That day didn't change my marriage on the surface. Nothing looked different. But internally, the axis had shifted. And once that happens, there's no going back to the way things were. Before that shift, my silence had been passive. It was the absence of resistance, the default setting of someone who believed harmony required self-erasure. Afterward, silence became something else. It became deliberate. I didn't announce any change. I didn't start asking questions out loud. From the outside, nothing about my behavior shifted. If anything, I became even calmer, even more agreeable. That was the part no one noticed. The difference between silence born of avoidance and silence chosen with intent looks identical to everyone else. But internally, I was listening differently. When she talked about money, I paid close attention to phrasing, to what was said with certainty and what was glossed over quickly. I noticed how often decisions were framed as already completed actions. I took care of it, I moved some things around. It's better this way. I stopped filling in gaps with trust and started registering them as gaps. At work, I did the same. I began treating my own life the way I treated complex systems on the job, observing patterns, identifying dependencies, understanding flows, not to interfere yet, just to see clearly. I started documenting small things privately: dates, comments, decisions that affected me but didn't include me. Not in a paranoid way, in a grounded way. I wrote them in the same leather notebook alongside work notes and reflections. It felt almost grounding, like reclaiming a part of my attention that had been outsourced for years. My silence, meanwhile, was misread. She seemed more relaxed than ever. With no questions coming from me, there was no friction to manage. The system ran smoothly. Friends commented on how easy our relationship seemed, how we never fought about money like other couples. I listened to those comments without reacting. What they didn't realize was that I was no longer quiet because I believed everything was fine. I was quiet because I was gathering context. There's a difference between being passive and being patient. Patience requires awareness. One evening, she mentioned in passing that she'd shifted some funds to prepare for an upcoming expense. No numbers, no accounts mentioned, just an update. I nodded, as I always had. But this time I noted it. The language, the lack of specificity, the assumption of consent. Another night, she joked that I'd be lost if anything ever happened to her because I didn't know how to manage our finances. She laughed. I smiled. Everyone laughed. Inside, I felt something settle, not anger, but certainty. That joke wasn't accidental. It was a belief she'd grown comfortable expressing out loud. And the fact that it didn't occur to her that it might be inappropriate told me how deeply the dynamic had set in. Still, I didn't react. Silence gave me something I hadn't had before: space to think without being steered. I began reviewing my own pay stubs at work, comparing them to what I remembered seeing deposited. I didn't accuse, I didn't assume wrongdoing. I simply noticed discrepancies in timing, not amounts, delays that hadn't existed before. That alone didn't mean anything, but patterns rarely announce themselves all at once. I reminded myself constantly: clarity first, conclusions later. The power of silence when chosen is that it reveals without provoking. People continue behaving exactly as they always have. They don't adjust for scrutiny. They don't exist. And so I stayed quiet. Not small, not afraid, just attentive. For the first time in years, my silence wasn't something done to me. It was something I was actively using to understand the shape of my own life before deciding whether it needed to change. What people misunderstand about preparation is that it rarely looks like action. There were no secret phone calls, no dramatic spreadsheets open late at night, no sudden personality shift. What I did instead was smaller, quieter, and far easier to miss, especially for people who already believed they understood me. I paid attention. That was it. I started with myself. I reviewed years of pay stubs, tax returns, and employment contracts, not because I suspected theft yet, but because I wanted a baseline, an objective record of what I had earned and when. I cross-referenced dates, noting when my salary increased, when bonuses were issued, and when reimbursements came through. I wasn't angry while doing this. I felt oddly calm, methodical, the kind of focus that comes from finally aligning your actions with your internal reality. Next, I began relearning systems I'd once understood but had allowed to atrophy: banking structures, joint versus individual account permissions. How can it be modified without closing accounts? The difference between visibility and control. It struck me how easily competence can be mistaken for irrelevance. I wasn't incapable. I'd simply stepped back long enough for others to assume I always would. At home, nothing changed. I still nodded at the same points in conversation, still let decisions be described after the fact, still accepted reassurances without comment. The consistency of my behavior reinforced everyone's assumptions about me, that I was comfortable, that I didn't care about details, that I trusted completely. That assumption was my camouflage. I began noticing what wasn't said. There were references to an account I'd never seen, mentions of moving things temporarily without specifying where, casual statements like, "It'll balance out later," as if the timeline didn't matter. Again, none of this proved anything, but it told me not to rush. I also started educating myself about financial abuse, not from a place of accusation, but recognition. Quiet forms of control, gatekeeping information, infantilizing a partner's capacity under the guise of protection. What struck me most was how closely the descriptions matched behaviors I'd normalized. Not because she was overtly malicious, but because the dynamic had been allowed to form unchecked. I kept my notes factual. No emotional language, dates, phrases, patterns. If I ever needed to look back, I wanted clarity, not interpretation colored by memory. She never noticed. Why would she? From her perspective, nothing had changed. The system still worked. I still complied. I still didn't challenge. There was no reason to suspect I was preparing for anything. Friends noticed something else instead. They commented that I seemed calmer, more centered, as if I'd finally relaxed into myself. They weren't wrong, but they misunderstood the source. This wasn't relaxation, it was grounding. I also began quietly updating my understanding of my legal standing, not through dramatic consultations, but through general research. Rights, responsibilities. What information was I entitled to by default? What is required is explicit consent. Knowledge has a way of restoring proportion. The more I learned, the less dramatic the situation felt, and the more manageable it became. That's the paradox of quiet preparation. It strips fear of its power. At no point did I plan revenge. There was no endgame yet, just a steady accumulation of context. I wanted to know the truth before deciding how to respond to it. And then slowly, something else happened. My internal posture changed. I stopped seeing myself as someone reacting to circumstances and started seeing myself as someone capable of choosing among options. The role I'd been assigned began to feel optional, not fixed. Still, I waited. Because when people believe you are invisible, they stop guarding what they do in front of you. They speak freely. They assume continuity, and continuity, when observed carefully, reveals everything. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, loosely connected at first, the way real understanding often does. A number here that didn't align, a date there that didn't make sense. Nothing dramatic enough to justify confrontation, but enough to demand attention. The moment of clarity happened on an afternoon that felt almost disappointingly ordinary. I was reviewing tax documents from the previous year, something I'd avoided for a long time because it had always felt abstract, handled. This time, I looked closely, line by line. I compared reported income with what I knew I'd earned, then traced where refunds had been deposited. That's when I noticed an account number I didn't recognize. At first, I assumed it was an administrative error, a routing difference, something benign. I didn't jump to conclusions. I opened old files, searched email threads, and looked for any record of an account opening that might explain it. There was none. The account wasn't joint. It wasn't one I had access to, and it had been receiving transfers, small at first, then gradually more consistent. Not large enough to raise alarms, just steady. That was the moment the picture shifted from vague discomfort to defined shape. I sat there longer than I needed to, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted to be precise. Emotional reactions blur details. I didn't want to blur. I traced the transfers backward. They corresponded with times she'd mentioned moving things around or setting something aside. The language I'd noted in my notebook now had weight, context. Still, I felt no urge to confront her immediately. What surprised me most was the absence of rage, There was no spike of adrenaline, no sense of betrayal crashing down all at once. Instead, there was clarity, cold, steady, undeniable. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was concealment. I didn't celebrate the discovery. I didn't feel victorious. If anything, I felt sobered. The truth had a gravity to it, not because it was shocking, but because it confirmed what I'd already begun to sense. The imbalance wasn't accidental. I spent the next few days verifying everything quietly. I checked timelines, confirmed amounts, made sure I wasn't misreading anything. I needed certainty, not suspicion. Each confirmation tightened the picture. This wasn't about saving for a surprise. There was no corresponding withdrawal for shared expenses, no disclosure, no conversation. It was a separate financial life built alongside the one I thought we shared. When she talked about our budget, it excluded that account entirely. I didn't feel humiliated, I felt resolved. Because now, for the first time, I wasn't operating on instinct or emotion. I had facts. And facts changed the nature of silence. Silence without information is submission. Silence with information is positioning. That distinction mattered. I continued acting exactly as I had before. Same tone, same routine, same apparent trust. There was no advantage in letting her know what I knew. Not yet. Knowledge loses power when revealed prematurely. Instead, I updated my notes. Cleanly, clearly, no judgment, just records. I also adjusted something internal, my timeline. Up until that point, I'd been gathering context without an endpoint. Now, I understand that a decision would eventually be required. Not immediately, but deliberately. I thought about confrontation and dismissed it. Confrontation seeks explanation. I didn't need an explanation. I thought about the accusation and dismissed that too. Accusations seek emotional resolution. I wasn't interested in emotional exchanges. What I wanted was alignment between what I knew and how I lived. That night, lying beside her, I felt the distance clearly for the first time. Not as resentment, but as a separation of realities. We were no longer operating on the same information, and she didn't know that yet. The private reveal wasn't a moment of triumph. It was a moment of final clarity. Once you see the structure you're standing in, you can no longer pretend it's something else. And from that point forward, every choice I made would be informed, not by fear, not by habit, but by truth. Knowing the truth doesn't automatically tell you what to do with it. For a while, I lived in that space between awareness and action. The facts were clear now, but clarity brings responsibility. Once you understand what's happening, inaction becomes a choice of its own. I gave myself time, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the weight of the decision ahead. I needed to understand not just what could be done, but what should be done, given who I wanted to be on the other side of this. There were options. I could confront her immediately, lay everything out, ask why, demand explanations. Many people would have. It would have been justified, but I knew myself well enough to understand what that path would lead to. Deflection, emotional escalation, rewritten narratives. Confrontation would center her response, not my reality. I could ignore it. Tell myself it wasn't worth the disruption. Rationalize that as long as our needs were met, the structure didn't matter. That option was familiar, comfortable. It would require the least immediate pain. But it would also require me to shrink again. There was a third option, quiet, irreversible, and grounded in reality rather than emotion. I could realign my life with the information I now had. That didn't mean revenge. It didn't mean punishment. It meant withdrawing my consent from a system I had never explicitly agreed to, and doing so in a way that didn't depend on her cooperation or understanding. The more I considered it, the clearer it became. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about authorship. Who was writing the terms of my life? I thought about the years I'd spent being easy, about how often I'd been praised for not needing much, about how silence had been mistaken for agreement. And I realized something that felt both sobering and liberating. I didn't owe anyone an explanation for reclaiming my agency. Explanations are often demanded by people who benefit from your compliance. So I made a decision. Not dramatic, not rushed, but firm. I would move forward without announcing my intentions. I would protect myself legally, financially, and structurally, and only when those pieces were in place would I speak. This wasn't secrecy, it was sequencing. There's a difference between hiding and preparing. One is rooted in fear, the other in clarity. I also set boundaries internally. I promised myself I wouldn't act out of spite. I wouldn't drain accounts or sabotage stability. I wouldn't mirror the behavior I just discovered. What I would do is ensure that no part of my livelihood could be controlled without my consent ever again. That meant accepting something difficult. Once I took the next steps, there would be no way to return to the illusion we'd been living in. The relationship would change regardless of how calm the eventual conversation might be. But the illusion had already ended for me. What remained was timing. I continued living as usual, not because I was pretending nothing had changed, but because I was respecting the process I'd chosen. Each day, my resolve grew quieter and stronger. I wasn't angry when I made the decision. I was steady. Steady enough to know that this choice would cost me something, but that not making it would cost me more. When people talk about turning points, they imagine moments filled with emotion. This one wasn't like that. It was defined by the absence of doubt, of urgency, of noise. Just a clear line drawn internally. Once crossed, there was no going back. Once the decision was made, everything became very simple. Not easy, but simple. I didn't rush. Rushing would have introduced mistakes, and mistakes would have created noise. What I needed now was stability, not speed. Every step had to be deliberate, boring, and defensible. I started with separation, not emotional but structural. At work, I updated my direct deposit information, quietly. No announcements, no dramatic shift in spending, just a new account opened solely in my name, receiving my income going forward. The change took effect in the next pay cycle. No one noticed. There was no reason they would. At home, nothing looked different. Bills were still paid, groceries still stocked, the rhythm of daily life remained intact. That was important. Sudden disruption would have raised questions, and questions invite scrutiny. I also began reestablishing visibility over my own financial footprint. Credit reports, account access, passwords I hadn't touched in years. I wasn't trying to take anything back yet. I was simply ensuring I understood what existed and where my name was attached. There's a strange calm that comes from reclaiming competence you never truly lost, only abandoned. I consulted professionals in the most unremarkable way possible. Not dramatic meetings, not crisis language, just information. I asked questions, listened, took notes, confirmed assumptions. Every answer reinforced the same truth. Acting quietly and within the system protected me far more than emotional confrontation ever could. And so I stayed quiet. She continued speaking about finances as she always had, confidently, abstractly, without specifics. I responded as I always had, calm, agreeable, non-intrusive. The continuity reassured her. She believed the system was unchanged. It wasn't. What shifted wasn't visible yet, but it was foundational. Control requires dependency, and dependency had begun to dissolve. I didn't cut her off. I didn't threaten stability. I simply ensured that my future earnings could no longer be redirected without my knowledge. That distinction matters. Silence during this phase wasn't avoidance, it was insulation. It prevented interference. It allowed systems to reset without emotional distortion. The most revealing part was how little resistance there was. When someone assumes your compliance is permanent, they don't guard against its absence. They don't prepare for autonomy returning. They don't imagine a scenario where you quietly step out of the role they've assigned you. So she didn't notice. Friends didn't notice either. From the outside, we still looked like the same couple. Still calm, still functional, still aligned. That's the danger of equating peace with health. Internally, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, grounded. Not powerful, not triumphant, grounded. Each step I took reduced my anxiety rather than increasing it. That's how I knew I was moving in the right direction. Fear thrives in confusion. Clarity starves it. I was careful not to overcorrect, No sudden spending, no symbolic gestures, no attempts to prove anything to myself. This wasn't about performance, it was about stability. By the time the second paycheck landed in my own account, I felt a quiet confirmation settle in. Not relief exactly, more like alignment. My actions finally matched my understanding. Still, I said nothing. Because timing matters. And silence, when chosen with intention, isn't weakness. It's preparation. Consequences don't always arrive with explanations. Sometimes they show up as confusion, as friction in systems that used to run smoothly, as questions no one knows how to ask yet. At first, the changes were subtle. She mentioned that a transfer had taken longer than expected, said a payment needed to be restructured. The language was vague, but the tone had shifted. There was less certainty in it now, fewer assumptions. I listened without reacting. From her perspective, something was off, but not enough to trigger an alarm. Systems she controlled had become less predictable. Not broken, just less responsive. The kind of disruption that creates irritation before concern. She checked things more often, mentioned money more frequently, asked casual questions about work, whether anything had changed, whether bonuses were coming up, whether my schedule might shift. I answered honestly, but briefly. Nothing had changed at work. That part was true. What had changed was access. The consequences of that change didn't look like punishment. They looked like an imbalance. Budgets that once seemed flexible became tighter. Decisions that had been made confidently now required reevaluation. Not because resources were gone, but because control had become incomplete. She didn't accuse me of anything. There was nothing concrete to accuse. From her vantage point, the system was simply behaving differently, and that difference unsettled her. I noticed small signs of stress, not panic, just unease. She double-checked expenses, revisited conversations we'd already had, tried to reassert certainty through reassurance. "It's fine," she'd say, more to herself than to me. "I'll figure it out." I nodded. What struck me most was how quickly the dynamic began to reveal itself once the flow changed. Without confrontation, without argument, the imbalance became visible through reaction alone. Control feels invisible until it's interrupted. Friends picked up on the shift before she did. They commented that she seemed distracted, preoccupied, less confident when talking about plans. No one connected it to me. Why would they? I was still the same quiet presence, still agreeable, still not interfering. The role I'd played for years protected me now. At home, the atmosphere changed subtly. Not hostile, just tense in a way that hadn't existed before. She asked more questions, not directly, but indirectly. Tested assumptions. Sought reassurance that the structure she relied on was still intact. I didn't withhold reassurance cruelly. I just didn't offer more than was asked. That restraint mattered. The consequences weren't dramatic because I hadn't made them dramatic. I hadn't removed support or demanded explanations. I'd simply stepped back into ownership of myself. And that was enough to destabilize a system built on one-sided control. There's an uncomfortable truth in that. If balance only exists when one person remains passive, it was never balanced to begin with. As days passed, the pattern became clearer. Her confidence was reactive now, not automatic. She adjusted, compensated, tried to restore equilibrium without understanding what had shifted. I watched, not with satisfaction, but with confirmation. The system required my compliance to function as it had, and my compliance was no longer guaranteed. Still, I waited. Because this phase wasn't about resolution yet, it was about observation, about letting consequences surface naturally without interference. I didn't need to prove anything. The structure was proving itself. The moment panic arrives, it often disguises itself as urgency. That's how it showed up for her. Not as fear at first, but as sudden attentiveness, a sharp increase in concern framed as care. She began asking more direct questions about timelines, upcoming expenses, and future plans. The tone was still controlled, but the edges were sharper now. Something she couldn't see had changed, and she could feel it. She suggested we sit down and review things together. The phrase was new, collaborative. A few weeks earlier, that kind of conversation wouldn't have been necessary. Things had been handled. I agreed without hesitation. Not because I was ready to explain, but because I wanted to see how she framed the problem. When we sat down, she spoke first. She explained that cash flow had been tighter than expected, that some adjustments she'd made weren't yielding the results she'd anticipated, that it might be a good idea for us to revisit how we manage things. There was no admission, no acknowledgement of concealment, just a recalibration of tone, as if the issue were logistical rather than structural. I listened carefully. This was the point where, months earlier, I might have stepped back into the old role, reassured her, deferred, accepted the explanation, and moved on. But that version of me no longer existed. Still, I didn't confront her, not yet. I asked neutral questions about numbers, about accounts, about access. Each question was reasonable, none was accusatory, and each one created a pause, small but noticeable. She answered selectively. General figures, rounded estimates, high-level explanations. When I asked for specifics, she offered summaries instead. When I asked about certain transfers, she deflected with timing issues. The pattern was unmistakable. What she was trying to fix wasn't the breach of trust. It was the loss of control. That's when I understood something important. Even if she had confessed in that moment, even if she had apologized sincerely, it wouldn't have changed the reality. Because trust doesn't fracture at the moment of discovery, it fractures at the moment of concealment, and that moment had passed long ago. I could see now that any attempt to fix things was reactive. It was motivated by instability, not accountability. The system was only being questioned because it had stopped working as intended, not because it was wrong. She sensed my distance and responded by increasing reassurance, promises of transparency, offers to do better. The words were carefully chosen, but they arrived too late, because they weren't accompanied by the one thing that mattered, full disclosure. I didn't argue, I didn't accuse, I simply didn't re-enter the system. And that refusal, quiet, calm, unwavering, was something she didn't know how to respond to. She asked if I was upset. I said no, which was true. I wasn't upset. I was done. Done pretending that collaboration could exist without equality. Done accepting partial information as trust. Done shrinking to preserve a structure that only functioned when I was absent from it. That conversation marked the end, even though neither of us said it out loud. From that point forward, her attempts to regain stability became more visible and more desperate. Suggestions, reassurances, subtle pressure. But the foundation had already shifted. Once you remove your consent from a system built on your silence, there is no way to restore it without rebuilding everything from the ground up. And by then, it was too late. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a climax. It felt like a formality. By the time we sat down to speak openly, everything that mattered had already been decided internally. Not in anger, not in haste, but with a calm that surprised even me. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't accuse, I didn't list grievances. I told her what I knew. I explained, simply and directly, that I was aware of the separate account, that I had seen the transfers. I understood how long it had been happening. There was no dramatization, no moral language. Just facts. For the first time since I'd known her, she didn't interrupt me. Her face changed, not dramatically, but enough to register. The certainty she usually carried dissolved into something more fragile. Confusion, then calculation. She asked how I'd found out. I told her I'd taken the time to look. There was a long pause. She began explaining, not denying, explaining, framing her actions as precautionary, as responsible, as something she'd done for us. She spoke about fear, about wanting security, about not trusting me to worry about details. I listened. I didn't argue with her interpretation. I didn't challenge her emotions. I didn't try to reframe the past. Instead, I said one thing. You made decisions about my life without my consent. The room went quiet. That sentence wasn't delivered with anger. It didn't need to be. It was precise. And precision has weight. She tried to respond, to justify, to contextualize, to soften the implication, but justification doesn't undo concealment, and context doesn't restore agency. I told her I wasn't interested in debating intentions, that this wasn't about whether she believed she was doing the right thing. It was about the fact that she'd removed my ability to choose. Yeah. I also told her I wasn't asking for anything. No apologies, no promises, no access. That surprised her more than anything else, because confrontation usually seeks something: resolution, reconciliation, reassurance. This one didn't. I explained that I'd already restructured my finances, that my income was now separate, that I was no longer participating in a system I hadn't agreed to. Again, no anger, no threats, just clarity. She asked if this meant the end of our marriage. I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, it means the end of the version of it that existed. That was the truth. There was nothing left to escalate, no leverage to apply. The power of the conversation came from its restraint, from the fact that I wasn't asking her to change. I had already changed what I needed to. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was heavy with realization. For the first time, she was facing the consequences of her actions without the buffer of my compliance. And for the first time, I wasn't negotiating my own autonomy. When the conversation ended, there were no raised voices, no slammed doors, just a quiet understanding that something fundamental had shifted. Confrontation doesn't have to be explosive to be final. Sometimes the absence of heat is what makes it irreversible. After everything was said, life didn't suddenly become dramatic or empty. It became quieter in a different way. Not the silence of avoidance or tension, but the silence that comes when something false has finally been removed. The days that followed weren't filled with arguments or negotiations. They were filled with adjustments. Practical ones, emotional ones, internal ones. We moved carefully around each other at first, like people relearning the dimensions of a shared space, but I noticed something almost immediately. I no longer felt the need to monitor my own words. I spoke plainly. I paused when I wanted to pause. I asked questions when I needed answers. That alone felt like a kind of freedom. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel wronged in a way that demanded validation. What I felt was solid, grounded, as if I had stepped back into alignment with myself after years of standing slightly off center. The identity I'd carried for so long, the agreeable one, the easy one, the man who didn't need much, began to fall away naturally, not replaced by bitterness or dominance, but by something quieter and more durable. Self-authorship. I began managing my own finances fully again. Not obsessively, just competently. I knew where things were. I knew what decisions were being made and why. The transparency wasn't a burden, it was grounding. It reminded me that adulthood isn't about avoiding responsibility, it's about choosing it. At work, something subtle changed too. I spoke a little more. Not louder, just with presence. I offered input when it mattered, declined requests when they crossed lines. The same people who'd once seen me as endlessly accommodating adjusted quickly. Boundaries, I learned, don't need explanations to be respected, just consistency. As for the marriage, I won't dress it up or simplify it. Once equality is removed for long enough, restoring it is not just difficult. It requires a willingness from both people to rebuild from the foundation. That willingness wasn't mutual, and that's something I've made peace with. Peace doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes it means accepting that a structure was built on an imbalance you can no longer tolerate and walking away without turning it into a war. What surprised me most was the absence of bitterness. I'd expected anger to show up eventually. It didn't. What showed up instead was clarity, a clean understanding of what I would never accept again, and what I would no longer need to explain. I'm still a quiet person, still reflective, still calm, but I am no longer invisible to myself. I understand now that silence isn't a virtue unless it's chosen, that cooperation without consent is not harmony, and that being underestimated can be dangerous, not because it weakens you, but because it teaches you to disappear. The man I am now doesn't seek control over others. He seeks authorship over his own life, and that has made all the difference. When I look back on this story now, what stays with me isn't the discovery of the hidden account, or even the slow realization that my marriage had become unbalanced. What stays with me is how easy it was to miss. Not because the signs weren't there, but because they were quiet, reasonable, and socially acceptable. Control rarely announces itself as control. More often, it arrives dressed as competence, as care, as efficiency. And when that happens, especially in relationships, we're taught to be grateful rather than curious. That's the danger. Financial abuse doesn't always look like restriction or punishment. Sometimes it looks like being relieved of responsibility, like not having to worry, like someone else handling things so you can focus on other parts of life. Until one day you realize you're no longer participating, you're being managed. I don't tell this story to position myself as a victim or to paint my former partner as a villain. Real life is more complex than that. People act out of fear as often as they act out of malice, and intentions, even flawed ones, don't always come from cruelty. But intentions don't erase impact. What matters in the end is agency. Every adult deserves authorship over their own life, over their labor, over the systems that shape their future. When that authorship is removed, slowly, subtly, for their own good, something essential is lost. And often, the person losing it is the last to notice. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's not suspicion or cynicism. It's awareness. Ask questions early. Stay curious about the structures you live inside. Not because you distrust people, but because trust without visibility isn't trust at all. It's abdication. Silence isn't inherently noble. Compromise isn't inherently healthy. And peace that requires you to disappear isn't peace. It's avoidance wearing a calmer face. I didn't reclaim my life by becoming louder, harsher, or more aggressive. I reclaimed it by becoming more present, by choosing clarity over comfort, by understanding that boundaries don't need to be announced with drama to be real. And if you recognize parts of yourself in this story, if you've ever felt strangely small in areas of your life that should belong to you, I want you to know this. You're not wrong for noticing. You're not selfish for wanting visibility. And it's not too late to step back into authorship. I'm curious to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a situation where control was disguised as care or silence was mistaken for agreement? Share your thoughts in the comments.